The snow began falling just as Eleanor Barrett realized she had no idea which direction would lead her back to Hill City, South Dakota, and the panic that seized her chest felt colder than the wind whipping through the Black Hills. She had been foolish to venture this far from town alone, but the photography expedition had seemed worth the risk that morning when the November sun still shone bright and deceiving overhead. Eleanor had arrived in Hill City 3 weeks prior from Boston, sent by her father's publishing company to document the changing face of the West in 1887. At 22 years old, she considered herself capable and independent, qualities that had served her well in the bustling streets of Massachusetts, but meant little against the raw wilderness of the Dakota Territory. The camera equipment weighed heavy in her leather satchel as she pushed forward through the pines, trying to retrace her steps. The footprints she had made earlier were already filling with fresh powder, disappearing like chalk marks in rain. Eleanor pulled her wool coat tighter, cursing herself for not wearing the heavier fur worn back at the boarding house. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees in the past hour, and the wind carried a bite that promised worse to come. She called out, though she knew no one could hear her this far from civilization. The sound of her own voice, small and swallowed by the storm, frightened her more than the silence. Eleanor had read accounts of people freezing to death in blizzards, found mere feet from safety because they could not see through the white curtain of snow. She had thought those stories exaggerated, dramatic tales meant to sell newspapers. Now she understood they were warnings. The light was fading fast, turning the world into shades of gray and white. Eleanor's fingers ached with cold despite her gloves, and her face felt raw where the wind struck it. She needed shelter, needed it desperately, but every direction looked the same. Trees and rocks and endless white, all of it unfamiliar, all of it hostile. She did not know that 5 miles behind her, Jackson Sutherland had found where her trail began. Jackson had been checking his trap lines when he spotted the footprints heading into the high country, small prints that clearly belonged to a woman wearing city boots with smooth soles, completely inadequate for mountain terrain. He had followed them for a quarter mile before the snow started falling, and his jaw tightened as he realized whoever made these tracks was heading straight into some of the most unforgiving territory in the Black Hills. Most men would have turned back, would have assumed the tracks belonged to someone who knew what they were doing, or would have written it off as not their concern. Jackson was not most men. At 26, he had lived in these mountains for 8 years, ever since leaving his family's failing ranch in Texas to seek his fortune in the gold fields. The fortune never materialized, but he had found something better, a kind of peace in the solitude, a sense of purpose in the simple work of surviving in a place that demanded respect. He also knew exactly what happened to people caught unprepared in mountain storms, and he would not leave anyone to that fate if he could prevent it. Jackson went back to his cabin only long enough to grab supplies. Extra blankets, matches wrapped in oilcloth, jerky and hardtack, a length of rope. He saddled his horse, a sturdy buckskin mare named Sage who had never failed him, and set out following the tracks before they could disappear completely. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes that clung to his hat brim and shoulders. He leaned down from the saddle, reading the signs that most people would have missed. The tracks wandered sometimes, showing hesitation, circling back in places. Whoever this was, they were lost and had been for a while. Hours passed. Jackson's face went numb, and ice formed in his beard, but he kept moving, kept following the faint depressions in the snow that marked where someone had walked. Sage picked her way carefully through the drifts, her breath steaming in the frigid air. The storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, It was getting worse. He almost missed her. Eleanor had collapsed against a boulder, her dark coat blending with the rock face, snow already starting to cover her. Jackson's heart lurched in his chest as he swung down from the saddle and rushed to her side. For a terrible moment he thought he was too late, but then he saw the slight rise and fall of her chest. She was alive but barely conscious, her lips tinged blue and her eyes glazed. "Can you hear me?" Jackson asked, his voice rough from disuse. He lived alone and sometimes went weeks without speaking to another soul. Eleanor's eyes focused on him with difficulty. "I am sorry," she whispered. "So foolish." "Plenty of time for apologies later," Jackson said. "Right now we need to get you warm." He knew they could not make it back to his cabin in these conditions, not with her in this state. They needed shelter immediately. Jackson scanned the area, his knowledge of the mountains serving him well. There was an overhang about 200 yards west, a place where the rock jutted out enough to provide protection from the worst of the wind and snow. It was not much, but it would have to do. "Can you stand?" he asked. Eleanor tried, but her legs would not support her weight. Without hesitation, Jackson lifted her into his arms, startled by how light she felt, how fragile. He settled her onto Sage's saddle, then led the horse toward the overhang, one hand keeping Eleanor steady. Each step felt like it took an eternity, the snow so thick he could barely see 5 feet ahead, but Jackson trusted his sense of direction the way other men trusted compasses. The overhang was still there, exactly where he remembered it. Jackson pulled Eleanor down from the horse and carried her into the shallow cave formed by the rock. It was not warm, but at least they were out of the wind. He worked quickly, spreading one blanket on the ground and wrapping Eleanor in 2 others, then set about building a fire with the dried wood and kindling he always kept in his saddlebags for emergencies. His hands shook slightly as he struck the match, not from cold but from the knowledge of how close a call this had been. If he had been an hour later, if the snow had covered her tracks completely, if he had decided to check his northern trap lines instead of his eastern ones. Too many ifs, all of them ending with this woman's death. The fire caught, small flames licking at the wood, growing stronger. Jackson added more fuel carefully, nursing it along until he had a proper blaze going. The warmth was immediate and blessed. He turned to Eleanor, who was still shaking violently under the blankets. "We need to get you out of those wet clothes," Jackson said, then immediately felt his face heat despite the cold. "I will turn around. There is a dry shirt in my pack. It will be too big, but it is better than freezing." Eleanor nodded, her teeth chattering too hard for speech. Jackson turned his back, listening to the rustle of fabric as she struggled with numb fingers to undress. After several minutes, she made a small sound of frustration. "I cannot manage the buttons," she said, her voice thick with embarrassment and exhaustion. Jackson closed his eyes briefly. "I will help, but I will only look at what I must. You have my word as a gentleman." He kept his promise, keeping his gaze averted as much as possible while his cold, stiffened fingers worked the small buttons of her blouse and the laces of her boots. Her clothes were soaked through, half frozen in places. It was a miracle she had lasted as long as she did. He helped her into his spare flannel shirt, which hung on her like a dress, then wrapped her back in the blankets and positioned her close to the fire. Jackson tended to Sage next, removing the saddle and rubbing the mare down with handfuls of dry pine needles to prevent her from catching cold. He tied her where the overhang would provide some shelter, then returned to the fire and Eleanor. "Thank you," she said softly. Her shaking had subsided somewhat, though she still huddled close to the flames. "You saved my life." "Not out of danger yet," Jackson said, though his tone was gentle. "Storm like this could last all night, maybe into tomorrow. We need to keep that fire going and keep you warm." "I am Eleanor Barrett," she said. "From Boston. I came to Hill City to photograph the territory for my father's publishing company." "Jackson Sutherland," he replied. "I have a cabin about 5 miles southeast of here. Been trapping and prospecting these mountains for near 8 years now." Eleanor looked at him properly for the first time, seeing a man with dark hair that needed cutting, a beard that was more practical than fashionable, and gray eyes that held a steadiness she found reassuring. He was handsome in a rough-hewn way, all sharp angles and weathered skin, but it was the kindness in those eyes that struck her most. This man had risked his own life to track her through a blizzard, and now he sat keeping watch over the fire as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "How did you find me?" she asked. "Saw your tracks heading into the high country. Knew whoever made them was in trouble." Jackson poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward. "These mountains do not forgive mistakes, especially not in winter. What were you doing out here alone?" Eleanor felt shame wash over her. "I wanted to photograph the landscape before the heavy snows came. I thought I had marked my path well enough, but I became turned around. By the time I realized I was lost, the storm had started." She paused, then added quietly, "You must think me terribly foolish." "I think you are from a place where mountains do not kill people for small errors in judgment," Jackson said. "But you are learning fast. That is what matters." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the howl of the wind beyond their shelter and the crackle of the fire. Eleanor felt warmth slowly returning to her body, though her fingers and toes still ached with it. She watched Jackson as he moved around their small camp, checking the fire, arranging the wood supply, making sure sage had not tangled her lead. Everything he did was economical and purposeful, no wasted motion. She found it fascinating, this way of existing so completely in tune with the environment. "You live up here alone?" she asked. "Mostly. I go into Hill City every few weeks for supplies and to sell whatever furs I have trapped. Sometimes I see other prospectors or hunters, but not often this time of year. Most folks with sense head to lower elevations once November hits." "Then why do you stay?" Jackson was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. "Peace, I suppose." "Had enough of people and their complications back in Texas. Up here, everything is simple. You work, you survive, or you do not. There is an honesty to it that I appreciate." Eleanor heard something in his voice, an old hurt he was not quite willing to share. She did not press, though her curiosity was piqued. Instead, she said, "I grew up surrounded by people and their complications. Sometimes I envied the explorers and photographers who got to leave the city behind, see the wild places. That is part of why I took this assignment, even though my father worried it was too dangerous for a woman alone." "He was right to worry," Jackson said, "but there was no judgment in it, just statement of fact." "I know that now," Eleanor admitted. She pulled the blankets tighter around herself. "Do you suppose he will have organized a search party?" "Doubtful anyone would head out in this storm. They will wait until it clears. We should reach town by tomorrow afternoon if the weather breaks." The implication was clear. They would be spending the night here together, alone. Eleanor felt she should be more concerned about propriety, about what people might say, but she was too grateful to be alive to care much. Besides, Jackson Sutherland had been nothing but respectful, and she trusted him in a way that surprised her, given they had only just met. As the night deepened, Jackson shared his provisions with her, the jerky and hardtack tasting better than any meal she could remember. He showed her how to position herself to get the most warmth from the fire without getting too close, and he told her stories about the mountains, about tracking elk through morning mist, and watching eagles hunt from the high peaks. Eleanor found herself captivated not just by the stories but by the man telling them, by the quiet passion in his voice when he spoke of this place he had made his home. "You love it here," she said. "I do," Jackson admitted. "Never felt that way about anywhere else. Like I belong, you know. Like the land and I reached an understanding." Eleanor thought about Boston, about the cobblestone streets and gas lamps and endless social obligations. She had never felt she belonged there, had always been too curious, too restless, too interested in things young ladies were not supposed to find interesting. "I envy you that," she said softly. "I have never felt I belonged anywhere." Jackson looked at her, really looked at her, and something passed between them in that moment, some recognition of kindred spirits. "Maybe you have not found your place yet," he said. "Does not mean it is not out there waiting." They talked through much of the night, taking turns keeping watch over the fire while the other dozed. Eleanor learned that Jackson had left Texas after his father lost the family ranch to drought and debt, that he had a younger sister married and living in Kansas, that he had once wanted to be a teacher before circumstances led him west. Jackson learned that Eleanor's mother had died when she was young, that her father had raised her in his publishing office as much as in their home, that she had learned photography from a family friend who believed women had just as much right to document the world as men. As dawn broke gray and cold, the storm finally began to ease. The snow still fell, but lighter now, and the wind had lost its vicious edge. Jackson built up the fire one last time and helped Eleanor back into her clothes, which had dried overnight by the flames. She changed modestly behind Sage while Jackson packed up their camp. "How do you feel?" he asked when she emerged. "Sore and tired, but alive thanks to you," Eleanor said. She meant it with every fiber of her being. Jackson helped her onto Sage, then climbed up behind her, his arms coming around to hold the reins. Eleanor felt the solid warmth of him at her back and found it comforting rather than improper. This man had saved her life. Whatever rules society might have about such things seemed meaningless out here, where survival mattered more than scandal. The ride down the mountain took hours. Jackson guided Sage carefully through the deep snow, choosing his path with the same sure confidence he had shown the night before. They stopped once to rest the horse and share the last of the jerky. The sky was clearing gradually, patches of blue showing through the gray. "It is beautiful," Eleanor said, looking out at the snow-covered peaks. "Even after nearly dying in it, I can see why you love this place." "It is not for everyone," Jackson said. "But for those it calls to, there is nowhere else like it." Eleanor wanted to ask if he thought it might call to her, but she held back, unsure what she was really asking or what his answer might mean. They reached the outskirts of Hill City in early afternoon. Word of Eleanor's disappearance had indeed spread, and a group of men were gathering at the livery stable, preparing to search as soon as the storm cleared completely. Eleanor's landlady, Mrs. Henderson, was among them, and she let out a cry of relief when she saw Eleanor riding into town. "Miss Barrett! Oh, thank heavens! We thought you were dead for certain." A crowd formed quickly, everyone talking at once, asking questions, expressing amazement that she had survived. Eleanor felt overwhelmed by it all, the noise and press of people after the quiet intimacy of the night before. She looked back at Jackson, who had dismounted and stood holding Sage's reins, looking uncomfortable with all the attention. The town doctor insisted on examining Eleanor, declaring her remarkably well given her ordeal, though he prescribed hot baths and rest. Mrs. Henderson fussed over her, wrapping her in more blankets and pressing cups of tea into her hands. Through it all, Eleanor kept glancing toward the door, but Jackson had disappeared. 3 days passed before she saw him again. Eleanor recovered quickly, her youth and general good health serving her well. She had expected Jackson to call to check on her condition at least, but he did not come. She told herself she was being foolish, that mountain men did not make social calls, but disappointment sat heavy in her chest nonetheless. On the fourth day, she saw him at the general store, selling furs to the proprietor. Eleanor did not hesitate, crossing the store quickly to his side. "Mr. Sutherland," she said, and watched him turn, surprise flickering across his face. "Miss Barrett, you are looking well. Thanks to you." She glanced around at the other customers, watching them with undisguised curiosity. "Might I speak with you privately?" Jackson nodded and followed her outside onto the wooden sidewalk. The day was cold but clear, the sun bright on the snow-covered streets. "I wanted to thank you properly," Eleanor said. "You risked your life for me, and I have not had the chance to express my gratitude." "No need," Jackson said, his tone gruff. "Any decent person would have done the same. I do not think that is true, but regardless, I am grateful." Eleanor hesitated, then pressed forward. "I also wanted to ask if you might be willing to guide me again under better circumstances. I still need photographs for my assignment, and I would feel much safer with someone who knows the country." Jackson's expression was unreadable. "I am not a guide, Miss Barrett. I am a trapper. I would pay you, of course. It is not about money." He looked away, jaw tight. "You should ask someone else. There are men in town who hire out for such things." Eleanor felt as though she had been slapped, though she could not say why his refusal hurt so much. "I see. Well, thank you again for saving my life. I will not trouble you further." She turned to leave, but Jackson caught her arm gently. "Wait." He released her immediately, as though the touch had burned him. "That came out wrong. I just meant that spending time together, just the two of us again, it would not be proper. People talk." "I do not care what people say," Eleanor said quietly. "I thought perhaps we had become friends out there, or at least might become friends. But if I was wrong, if you would rather not associate with me, I will respect that." Jackson looked at her, and Eleanor saw conflict in his gray eyes, some internal struggle he was waging with himself. Finally, he said, "You are not wrong. But Miss Barrett, Eleanor, you are from Boston. You have a life waiting for you back east. I am a man who lives alone in the mountains with barely 2 coins to rub together. Friendship between us, anything between us, it can only end in hurt." Understanding dawned on Eleanor, and with it, a flutter of something in her chest that felt dangerously like hope. "And if I do not want to go back to Boston, if I find I prefer the mountains and the people in them, then I would say 3 days is not near enough time to make that kind of decision," Jackson said, but his voice had softened. "I would say you should be certain before you burn any bridges." "Will you at least consider being my guide?" Eleanor asked. "I promise to maintain all appropriate proprieties. Mrs. Henderson's nephew could come along as chaperone if you like, but I need to finish this assignment and I trust you to keep me safe. That is all I am asking. For now." The "for now" hung between them, full of implication. Jackson studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, but we do this proper. With a chaperone, at least until folks in town stop gossiping about us, and you follow my instructions exactly when we are in the back country. No wandering off, no taking chances." "Agreed," Eleanor said, unable to keep the smile from her face. Over the next several weeks, they fell into a routine. 3 times a week, Jackson would come to town and they would venture out into the less treacherous areas around Hill City, usually with Mrs. Henderson's nephew Billy in tow as chaperone. Eleanor took her photographs while Jackson pointed out landmarks and shared his knowledge of the territory. Billy, 16 and easily bored, generally wandered off to skip rocks or explore, leaving them with a semblance of privacy. Eleanor found herself falling in love with the Black Hills, with the way morning light turned the frost to diamonds, and the way the snow clung to pine branches like lace. She photographed miners working their claims and homesteaders, building new lives and the rough wooden buildings of Hill City against the backdrop of mountains. But mostly, she found herself falling for the quiet man who taught her to read animal tracks in the snow and warned her away from avalanche danger, and showed her where the elk bedded down at night. Jackson fought it at first, keeping their conversations focused on the practical matters of navigation and survival. But gradually, his guard lowered. He started sharing more stories, asking about her life in Boston, listening with genuine interest as she described growing up in her father's publishing house. He laughed at her jokes, rare sounds that Eleanor treasured. He began pointing out beautiful views not because they were safe or important to know, but simply because he wanted to share them with her. Mrs. Henderson noticed, of course. The whole town noticed. Opinions were divided. Some thought it romantic, a city girl and a mountain man finding each other. Others thought it foolish, that Eleanor was throwing away her chances at a proper marriage back east for a man with no prospects. Jackson heard the whispers when he came to town, saw the looks. It made him pull back again, reminded him of all the reasons this was a bad idea. It came to a head in late December. They had taken Billy and ridden out to a frozen waterfall Eleanor wanted to photograph. The boy had wandered off as usual, and Eleanor was setting up her camera when Jackson said abruptly, "You should go back to Boston." Eleanor's hands stilled on the equipment. "What? After you finish your assignment, you should go home. You do not belong here." "I think I should be the judge of where I belong," Eleanor said carefully. "Look around you, Eleanor. This is a hard life. Cold winters, isolation, no guarantees. You are used to society and culture and comfort. You would grow to hate it here, and you would hate me for being the reason you stayed." Eleanor set down the camera and turned to face him fully. "Do you want me to leave? What I want does not matter. It matters to me." She took a step closer. "Jackson, I know you have feelings for me. I see it in the way you look at me, the way you make sure I am always safe and warm. I have feelings for you too. Can we not simply admit that? And what good does admitting it do?" Jackson's voice was rough with emotion. "Even if you stayed, even if we married, what kind of life could I give you? A one-room cabin with no proper windows. Weeks of the same food because nothing fresh grows in winter. Isolation so complete you might not see another woman for months at a time. You deserve better than that." "You do not get to decide what I deserve," Eleanor said, her own temper rising now. "I am not some fragile flower that needs protecting from reality. I know what life here would entail. I am not naive. Knowing and living it are different things. Then let me try. Let me spend a winter here, experience it fully. If at the end of it I want to return to Boston, I will go with your blessing. But Jackson, you cannot make this decision for me. It is not fair." They stood facing each other in the snow, breath steaming in the cold air, years of loneliness and longing and fear hanging between them. Finally, Jackson said quietly, "I could not bear it if you grew to regret me." Eleanor's anger melted away, replaced by tenderness. She reached out and took his gloved hand in hers. "The only thing I would regret is not trying, is walking away from you, because it seemed too difficult or too different from what my life was supposed to be. I am tired of living according to other people's expectations. I want to live according to my own heart, and my heart is telling me to stay." Jackson looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her face. "You are sure?" "I am sure." He kissed her then, gentle at first and then deeper, all the emotion he had been holding back pouring into it. Eleanor kissed him back, her free hand coming up to cup his bearded cheek, feeling like she had finally found what she had been searching for without knowing it. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Jackson's eyes held a vulnerability she had never seen before. "I love you," he said simply. "Have since that first night, I think, watching you by the fire, so brave even though you were terrified. I tried not to, but I do." "I love you too," Eleanor whispered, "and I am not going anywhere." They married in January of 1888, a simple ceremony in Hill City's small church with Mrs. Henderson and Billy as witnesses. Eleanor wrote to her father explaining her decision. His return letter expressed concern but also grudging respect for her choice. He agreed to continue buying her photographs, giving her a source of income that would help supplement Jackson's trapping. The rest of that first winter tested Eleanor in ways she had not anticipated. The cold was relentless, seeping through every crack in the cabin walls despite Jackson's best efforts to seal them. She learned to cook over an open fire, to melt snow for water, to recognize the signs of frostbite and hypothermia. She learned the profound silence that came with being snowed in for days at a time, when even the wind seemed to hold its breath. But she also learned the joy of curling up with Jackson under heavy quilts, talking by firelight about their dreams and hopes. She learned the satisfaction of baking bread successfully after a dozen failed attempts, of helping Jackson skin and process furs, of capturing the stark beauty of winter in her photographs. She learned that love could grow stronger in hardship, that two people working together could face almost anything. Spring came eventually, as it always does, and with it a softening in Eleanor's understanding of what home meant. It was not a place full of people and activity. It was this cabin, these mountains, this man who had tracked her footprints through a blizzard, because he could not abide the thought of someone dying alone in the cold. By summer, Eleanor knew without doubt that she had made the right choice. She accompanied Jackson on his rounds, photographing wildlife and landscapes. She befriended the few other women living in the high country, forming a network of support that made the isolation less complete. She corresponded with her father, sending him not just photographs but articles about life in the Dakota Territory, which he published to surprising acclaim. In the fall of 1888, Eleanor realized she was pregnant. The news filled her with equal parts joy and terror. The nearest doctor was in Hill City, hours away even in good weather. Women died in childbirth out here, far from medical help, but Jackson held her close and promised he would keep both her and their child safe, and she believed him. They moved to Hill City for the last 2 months of her pregnancy, boarding with Mrs. Henderson. Jackson found work at the livery stable to pay for their room and board, though he chafed at being away from the mountains. But Eleanor's safety mattered more than his comfort, so he bore it without complaint. Their son was born in March of 1889 during another snowstorm, as though the weather wanted to remind them of how they had met. The labor was long and difficult, but both Eleanor and the baby survived. They named him Thomas, after Jackson's father, and called him Tommy. He had Eleanor's dark hair and Jackson's gray eyes and a pair of lungs that could wake the dead. Holding his son for the first time, Jackson felt something shift inside him. He had thought he understood love after meeting Eleanor, but this was different, fiercer. This tiny person depended on him completely, trusted him to provide and protect. It was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. They returned to the cabin when Tommy was a month old. Eleanor had worried about raising a child in such isolation, but Jackson proved to be a devoted father. He built a cradle by the fire and sang to Tommy in a surprisingly good voice, and walked the floor with him during colicky nights, so Eleanor could sleep. They developed new routines, working together to balance the demands of a baby with the practical needs of survival. Tommy grew strong and healthy, thriving in the mountain air. By his first birthday, he was walking and getting into everything, fascinated by the world around him. Eleanor photographed him constantly, documenting every stage of development, sending pictures to her father in Boston along with stories of their life. Her father visited in the summer of 1890, making the long journey west to meet his grandson and see for himself the life his daughter had chosen. Eleanor had been nervous about his arrival, worried he would be disappointed or would try to convince her to return to Boston. But watching her father's face as Jackson showed him around their property, as Tommy toddled over with a pine cone clutched in his chubby fist, she saw acceptance and even approval. "You are happy," her father said on his last evening with them, the two of them sitting on the porch while Jackson put Tommy to bed inside. "I am," Eleanor said simply. "That is all I ever wanted for you." He paused, then added, "Your mother would have liked him. Jackson, I mean." She always appreciated people who were genuine. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. Her father rarely spoke of her mother. "Thank you for saying that. I was wrong to worry. You knew your own heart better than I did. I should have trusted you." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Eleanor thought about the girl she had been when she first came to Hill City, so sure she was just passing through, just documenting someone else's life before returning to her own. She had not known she was coming home. The years that followed brought both challenges and joys. A second child, a daughter they named Margaret after Eleanor's mother, was born in 1892. Unlike her brother, Maggie was quiet and contemplative, content to sit for hours watching the world around her. She had her mother's curiosity and her father's patience, a combination that served her well. Jackson built an addition to the cabin, giving them more space as the children grew. Eleanor's photography work continued to provide steady income, and Jackson's trapping had several good years. They were not wealthy by any means, but they had enough, and more importantly, they had each other. In 1895, when Tommy was 6 and Maggie 3, they made a family trip to Boston so the children could see where their mother had grown up. The city overwhelmed both kids, so much noise and so many people, but they were fascinated too. Eleanor showed them her father's publishing house and the park where she had played as a child. But after 2 weeks, both children were asking when they could go home to the mountains, and Eleanor realized they truly were children of the West, as much a part of that landscape as the pines and the elk. The journey back to Hill City felt like coming up for air after being underwater. As the train crossed into Dakota territory and the Black Hills came into view, Eleanor felt her whole body relax. Jackson, sitting beside her with Maggie asleep in his lap and Tommy pressed against the window excitedly pointing out familiar landmarks, looked over and smiled. "Good to be going home." He asked. "The best," Eleanor agreed. They fell back into their routines, but something had shifted. The trip east had confirmed what Eleanor already knew but had perhaps not fully articulated. She had not simply adjusted to life in the mountains. She loved it, needed it the way she needed air and water. The vastness and the wildness fed something in her soul that the city never could. As the children grew older, they became part of the mountain community in their own right. Tommy learned trapping from his father and could navigate the high country by the time he was 10. Maggie had inherited her mother's eye for beauty, and by 8 was taking her own photographs with a camera Eleanor's father had sent as a gift. Both children were educated at home, with Eleanor teaching them reading and mathematics and history, while Jackson taught them the practical skills of survival and self-sufficiency. In 1898, a bad winter hit the Black Hills, worse than any Eleanor had experienced. Snow fell for weeks, temperatures dropped below zero and stayed there. Several families in the high country lost livestock, and 2 homesteads burned down when chimneys caught fire. Jackson and Eleanor opened their home to a family whose cabin had been destroyed, housing them for nearly 2 months until the spring thaw allowed them to rebuild. It was a hard time, but it brought the scattered community closer together. They had always helped each other when needed, but this winter forged bonds that would last for years. Eleanor organized a system of checking on the more isolated families, making sure everyone had sufficient food and fuel. Jackson taught some of the newer settlers advanced winter survival skills. The children, including Tommy and Maggie, carried messages between homesteads and helped with chores where needed. When spring finally came, everyone emerged exhausted but proud. They had survived together, proving that the mountain community was more than just a collection of individuals. They were neighbors in the truest sense, people who would risk their own comfort and safety to help others. Eleanor photographed it all, documenting the harsh realities alongside the small triumphs. Her images from that winter, published in several Eastern newspapers and magazines, brought attention to the resilience of Western settlers and helped change some of the prevailing attitudes about life in the territories. By 1900, Tommy was 11 and talking about wanting to learn mining, while Maggie at 8 was insisting she would become a professional photographer like her mother. Eleanor and Jackson listened to their children's dreams with pride, encouraging them while also teaching them the value of hard work and persistence. Jackson, now 39, had started to feel the effects of years of hard mountain living. His joints ached in cold weather, and old injuries from his youth bothered him more. But he remained strong and capable, adapting his work as needed. He took on more hunting guide work and less trapping, finding it easier on his body and often more profitable. Eleanor, at 35, had developed a reputation as one of the finest photographers in the Dakota Territory. Her work appeared regularly in publications back east, and she had even had several images displayed in a gallery in Chicago. But she never forgot that her success had been built on the foundation of that terrifying day when she got lost in the mountains, and a cowboy risked everything to find her. On their 12th anniversary, Jackson surprised her by taking her back to the overhang where they had sheltered during the blizzard. He had packed a picnic, and they sat in that same spot, older now and weathered by the years, but still deeply in love. "You ever regret it?" Jackson asked as they watched the sun set over the peaks. "Giving up your old life for this one?" Eleanor leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid strength of him. "Never, not once. This is where I belong, Jackson, with you, with our children in these mountains. I found myself here. I found home." "I think about that day sometimes," Jackson admitted. "What would have happened if I had decided to check different trap lines, if I had missed your tracks? How close we came to never knowing each other. But you did not miss them. You found me, Jackson. You tracked me through a blizzard and saved my life, and in doing so, you gave me a life worth living." He kissed the top of her head. "You gave me the same thing. I was just existing before you, getting through the days. You taught me how to really live again." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, wrapped in each other and in the shared history of all the years between that desperate night and this peaceful evening. The mountains surrounded them, eternal and unchanging, bearing witness to their love. Tommy eventually followed his mining ambitions, working claims with Jackson's guidance and proving to have a good eye for promising sites. He never struck it rich, but he made a decent living and married a local girl named Sarah in 1904. Maggie pursued photography with single-minded determination, eventually apprenticing with a photographer in Denver before returning to Hill City to open her own studio. Jackson and Eleanor became grandparents in 1905, when Tommy and Sarah had a son. Holding that baby, seeing the continuation of what he and Eleanor had built together, Jackson felt a profound sense of gratitude. His life had not turned out anything like he had planned when he left Texas all those years ago, but it had turned out better than he ever could have imagined. As they grew older, they spent more time in Hill City and less in the high cabin, eventually selling the property to a young family and moving to town permanently in 1910. It was an adjustment, being around people all the time again, but they had each other and their children nearby, and that made it worthwhile. Eleanor continued photographing until her hands grew too unsteady to manage the equipment properly. She compiled her life's work into several books, documenting the transformation of the Dakota Territory from wilderness to settled land. Her images provided an invaluable record of a vanishing way of life, and historians would reference them for generations to come. Jackson lived until 1925, passing peacefully in his sleep at 74. He had lived long enough to see automobiles become common and airplanes take to the skies, marveling at how much the world had changed since his youth. But the mountains he had loved remained constant, and his children and grandchildren continued to call them home. Eleanor survived him by 3 years, dying in 1928 at the age of 63. In her final days, surrounded by family, she often spoke of that day in 1887 when a snowstorm had changed everything. She spoke of the cowboy who had tracked her footprints through the blizzard, refusing to give up, refusing to let her die alone in the cold. She spoke of the life they had built together in those mountains, the love that had sustained them through hard times and good. On her last evening, with Maggie holding one hand and Tommy the other, Eleanor smiled and said clearly, "I am ready to go. Tell him I am coming home." They buried her next to Jackson on a hillside overlooking the Black Hills, the mountains they had both loved stretching out in every direction. The headstone was simple, bearing their names and dates, but Tommy added one more line beneath at Maggie's suggestion. She was lost until he found her, and together they found home. Their story became part of local legend, told and retold over the years. The details changed with each telling, becoming more dramatic and romantic, but the heart of it remained true. A woman from the East who came west to document a vanishing world. A mountain man who saved her life and found his own life transformed in the process. Two lonely souls who recognized something in each other that cold night by the fire, and had the courage to build a life together, despite all the reasons it should not have worked. Their descendants still live in the Black Hills, carrying forward the legacy of resilience and love that Jackson and Eleanor established. The photographs Eleanor took hang in museums and historical societies throughout the region. The cabin Jackson built, though no longer standing, is marked on historical maps as a homestead site. But their real legacy is simpler and more profound. They loved each other truly, raised their children well, and proved that home is not a place you come from but a place you create with the people you love. The mountains stand eternal, keeping watch over the generations that followed, bearing silent witness to all the footprints that marked their snow, all the lives that intersected in their shadow, all the love stories that began with someone being lost and someone else refusing to give up the search.